Throughout history, human beings have been drawn to patterns, celestial events, geopolitical shifts, and psychological archetypes. We try to interpret them to give meaning to their alignment. And lately, a growing number of people have been sensing that something significant has shifted. Something final. Some call it the last sign. Now, before we dive into the emotional or spiritual implications, let's start with what we can observe: biological and behavioral responses to global stressors. Our brains are wired to scan for threat and pattern. When enough chaotic signals emerge in our environment, conflict, climate, social unrest, our brainstem and limbic systems interpret them as a collective danger. This isn't prophecy. It's neurobiology. But here's the paradox. The more we perceive signs of an ending, the more deeply we begin to ask about meaning, purpose, and transcendence. The more chaotic the world becomes, the more the human brain seeks coherence. This is where the idea of a final sign, a last rapture signal, gains traction. Maybe it's symbolic, maybe it's literal. But either way, we must understand this moment not as a time to panic, but as a call to optimize our choices, our mindset, and our legacy. The final sign is not just about what's coming. It's about how we respond with clarity, responsibility, and presence. The human brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It is designed not merely to respond to the world, but to anticipate it. From the earliest days of our evolution, survival depended on recognizing subtle shifts in our environment. Changes in the weather, movements in the bushes, sounds in the distance. These weren't random cues. They were signals. And the brain, especially regions like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, evolved to analyze those signals rapidly, often subconsciously, and assign them meaning. This is where our ability to detect patterns comes from. It's not just a cognitive trick. It's a deep neurobiological function that ensured we could avoid predators, find food, and stay connected with our social groups. In modern times, those same systems are still online. They're active every single day. But instead of lions or thunderstorms, they're interpreting stock market crashes, media headlines, viral videos, and geopolitical tension. The stimuli have changed, but the processing mechanisms remain the same. Our brains still ask, is this dangerous? Is this important? Does this fit a larger pattern? And because we are constantly exposed to data through social media, news cycles, and online commentary, the brain starts stringing events together. Even when those events are unrelated, we start to feel they are connected. This is a feature of the human nervous system, not a flaw. But it can lead us to conclusions that feel deeply true, even if they're not empirically grounded. This is particularly relevant in moments of heightened uncertainty. When large-scale events converge, climate disruptions, economic instability, wars, pandemic, the human brain naturally looks for what scientists call salient signals. These are pieces of information that stand out because they feel significant. But again, this is based not just on logic, but on emotional weight. Something becomes salient not because it's objectively important, but because our brains tag it with emotional or survival relevance. This is how the idea of a last rapture sign can take hold. It feels meaningful because it coincides with heightened nervous system activity. We're alert, we're uncertain, we're scanning for meaning, and so when something unusual happens, we latch onto it as part of a larger narrative. The narrative doesn't have to be religious for it to trigger the same circuitry. Whether it's a prophecy, a scientific forecast, or a social media theory, what matters is how our nervous system processes it. The frontal cortex attempts to reason through it. The limbic system colors it with emotional weight. The brainstem keeps scanning for threat, always on edge. This creates a loop. More alertness leads to more meaning-making, which leads to more perceived signs, which in turn increases alertness. It's self-reinforcing, and it's exhausting, but it's also understandable. This is how the human brain works under pressure. And when enough people begin to perceive signs, whether those signs are rooted in fact or fear, they begin to influence each other. This is where collective pattern recognition becomes collective narrative. We don't just see the sign ourselves, we see others reacting to it. Mirror neurons activate. Social contagion takes over. A feeling of anticipation or dread starts to spread, not just through logic, but through limbic resonance. Entire communities can start to feel that something is happening, even when no single event confirms it. This is how powerful the brain's pattern recognition system is, not just individually, but socially. Now, this doesn't mean every pattern we recognize is false. Not at all. Some signals are meaningful. Some events are connected. But the key point is this. Our sense of meaning is filtered through biology. And in times of global stress, our biology is not neutral. It is hyper-tuned to detect threat and create coherence, even if that coherence is based on incomplete or unrelated data. This is why people begin talking about signs, not just in a religious sense, but in a neurological one. We're looking for clarity, and the brain responds by pulling fragments into patterns. The sensation that the last sign just appeared is not just spiritual, it's physiological. It's an emergent experience that results from a brain doing exactly what it evolved to do: search for meaning in the chaos. Understanding this isn't meant to dismiss spiritual insight or prophecy. It's meant to deepen our awareness of how our minds work, so we can discern between a panic-driven conclusion and a deeply informed realization. The better we understand the mechanisms behind our own pattern recognition, the more equipped we are to respond, not just to events, but to the meaning we assign to them. And that kind of awareness, especially now, is more valuable than ever. There is a profound tension in the human mind between control and uncertainty. At its core, this tension shapes how we perceive the world and how we interpret events around us. The idea of a final sign, a last signal before something transformational or catastrophic happens, offers a kind of closure that the brain craves. It creates the illusion that we are not drifting aimlessly through chaos, but that there is an intelligible sequence unfolding, that things are happening for a reason and on some kind of timeline. This illusion is powerful because it provides structure. And when we are surrounded by unpredictable change, that structure feels like safety. One of the primary roles of the human brain is to reduce uncertainty. The prefrontal cortex, which governs our capacity for planning and foresight, is constantly working to model the future. It runs simulations, checks possibilities, and tries to predict outcomes based on present information. This isn't a conscious choice. It's what our minds are always doing. We want to know what happens next. We want to know what to expect. This expectation creates a sense of agency. The more we feel we can anticipate events, the more we believe we can control them. When things start to feel unpredictable or overwhelming, when the variables become too complex or the signals too many, the brain's instinctive response is to grasp for anything that seems to offer clarity or prediction. That's when the illusion of control becomes most tempting. So when a narrative comes along that claims we are nearing the end, or that a final sign has just been revealed, it doesn't just offer meaning, it offers predictability. Even if the message is ominous, it relieves the anxiety of randomness. A predicted crisis is in some ways less stressful than an unknown one. We would rather hear that things are about to fall apart in a specific way than live in the fog of ambiguity. This isn't irrational. It's deeply tied to how our nervous systems are wired. Even about difficult outcomes activates different circuits in the brain than open-ended fear. When we think we understand what's coming, the brain can begin preparing for it. It builds cognitive and emotional buffers. That's why the idea of a last rapture sign feels oddly stabilizing to some people. It provides the structure the mind needs to begin settling, even if what it's settling into is a sense of ending. But this sense of control is largely an illusion. While it is true that we can observe patterns and trends and use those to make reasonable predictions, most of what unfolds in our lives, and certainly in global events, is outside our direct control. Still, the psychological benefits of believing in control can't be overstated. Belief in signs and predictions often fills the gap between what we can measure and what we emotionally need. It's a coping mechanism, but it's also an organizing principle. And that's why it persists even in highly rational or skeptical individuals. When the world gets noisy, the brain tries to simplify. The notion that we've now seen the last major sign before an ultimate event gives the brain a simple anchor. It says, here's where we are, here's what it means, here's what comes next. The illusion of control is not just comforting, it's neurologically regulating. Social dynamics amplify this effect. When groups of people collectively adopt the belief that we are witnessing final or apocalyptic signals, individual brains sync with the emotional rhythm of the group. We mirror each other's urgency. We absorb each other's certainty. The perceived control of one person becomes the shared confidence of a crowd. And in many cases, the belief spreads not because it is proven, but because it relieves a shared psychological tension. It's a release valve for collective anxiety. But what's important to understand is that this is a natural response, not a weakness. The brain isn't malfunctioning when it creates meaning or perceives control in complex times. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do: reduce uncertainty, build a working model of reality, and prepare for possible outcomes. The key is not to fight this process, but to recognize it. Because once we see it clearly, we are less likely to confuse emotional certainty with factual accuracy. The illusion of control may not give us actual power over events, but it gives us a sense of orientation. And while that can be stabilizing, it can also mislead us. It can cause us to close ourselves off from new data, to lock into a single narrative, or to prepare for a version of the future that may never arrive. And the challenge is to hold that sense of meaning gently, not as an absolute truth, but as a reflection of the brain's attempt to cope with complexity. Understanding that the brain seeks control and uncertainty allows us to make better decisions, ones grounded not in fear, but in awareness. There's something fascinating about the way crisis sharpens our perception. It doesn't just create urgency, it activates parts of the brain that normally remain quiet in ordinary situations. The human mind is not just a passive receiver of reality, it is a deeply adaptive system constantly responding to both internal and external signals. When crisis strikes, something profound happens, not only in our environments, but within our physiology. The body becomes alert. Heart rate increases. Tension narrows. The world suddenly feels louder, more vivid, more interconnected. And as this biological stress response rises, so too does a deeper need, a need to understand why. This is where a unique psychological shift begins to take place. People who were once uninterested in spirituality or meaning begin to ask existential questions. People who live by reason and logic begin to look for something more expansive, not necessarily in the form of religion, but in the search for purpose, for transcendence. This transition is not irrational. It's one of the most ancient parts of our psychological architecture. When faced with suffering, the mind instinctively searches for coherence. When confronted with the possibility that life is fragile, we begin to ask what it's for. And it's in this state, heightened awareness, elevated emotion, a sense of urgency, that many begin to believe they're seeing signs or participating in something bigger than themselves. It's important to understand that this movement toward meaning in crisis is not necessarily a spiritual revelation in itself. Often it's a neurological adaptation in moments of prolonged or overwhelming stress. The brain shifts its processing style. Under normal conditions, we think in a mostly linear way, cause and effect, goals and outcomes. But in times of crisis, the brain opens up to nonlinear associations. It begins connecting things across time and space, looking for patterns, symbols, and metaphors. It stops thinking only in terms of survival and begins to think in terms of significance. In fact, one of the reasons apocalyptic or prophetic ideas gain popularity during collective hardship is because they offer symbolic meaning in the face of chaos. They tap into that deep primal need to believe that what we're going through is not random. None of this diminishes the sincerity of people's spiritual experiences during hardship. In fact, it explains why they often feel more real, more urgent, more vivid than anything else. When we are in crisis, the filters that normally block us from deep reflection fall away. We become more open to new perspectives. The boundaries between logic and intuition begin to blur. And in that space, transformation becomes possible. Not necessarily because the crisis itself is divine, but because the conditions it creates inside the brain allow us to access layers of meaning that were previously hidden beneath routine and comfort. Historically, nearly every major shift in collective human consciousness has emerged from some form of crisis. Whether it's societal collapse, war, famine, or economic disruption, these moments tend to act as catalysts. They press against the normal limits of the human mind, forcing it to expand, to question, to evolve. People turn inward and outward at the same time. They reassess their values. They ask whether they've been living the right way. They become more attuned to the suffering of others. In that sense, crisis can serve as a strange kind of mirror, one that doesn't just reflect reality, but reflects back what we're capable of becoming. It's also worth noting that the idea of transformation through crisis is not just a human phenomenon. In nature, stress is often the trigger for change. Bones become stronger when subjected to weight-bearing stress. The immune system becomes more intelligent after being exposed to pathogens. Even ecosystems can evolve and reorganize after fires or floods. So when the human psyche begins to reorganize itself in response to crisis, it's following a deeply biological precedent. Growth, in many cases, doesn't happen in spite of pressure. It happens because. So when we talk about people perceiving signs or feeling a sense of spiritual awakening in chaotic times, we're not talking about something strange or fringe. We're talking about a deep, measurable, and well-documented psychological phenomenon. People are not just reacting to external events. They're being reorganized by them from the inside out. Their nervous systems are tuning into something they might have ignored before. Their perception shifts. Their questions get deeper. And whether you call it spirituality, awareness, or just heightened consciousness, it's all pointing toward the same thing. The human need for transcendence becomes most vivid when life itself feels unstable. Crisis doesn't only strip us down, it reveals what we've always had access to. And sometimes the clearest signs don't come from the outside. They emerge from within. When the old frameworks break in, we realize we've been capable of more meaning, more presence, more depth all along. The chaos becomes the signal. The stress becomes the spark. And in that, something truly transformational begins. There's a subtle but critical difference between reacting and responding. Though the two often appear similar on the surface, the processes behind them are fundamentally different. A reaction is immediate. It's fast, automatic, and emotionally driven. It bypasses thoughtful analysis in favor of instinct. A response, on the other hand, takes place with a degree of space. It involves awareness, processing, and intention. And in times of perceived urgency, when people believe a final sign has appeared, or that something irreversible is about to unfold, this distinction becomes more important than ever. The human brain is designed to react quickly to threat. This is evolutionary. It had to be this way. If our ancestors saw movement in the brush and paused to analyze whether it was a predator or just the wind, they might not have survived long enough to pass on their genes. So the brain learned to err on the side of caution. It triggers a rapid cascade of signals through the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the adrenal glands. Adrenaline is released. Muscles tense. Heart rate climbs. Vision narrows. All of this happens in seconds, often without our conscious input. This system kept us alive, but it was built for short-term physical threats. It wasn't designed for long-term complex or abstract crises, the kind we face today. When people hear that a final sign has appeared, something symbolic, prophetic, or ominous, they often experience that same internal shift. Their nervous system registers the information as a threat, even if the situation doesn't involve any direct danger. This is one of the complexities of the modern world. We are constantly processing signals that our bodies interpret as urgent, even when our minds can't verify them. And when that urgency isn't grounded in clarity, the result is often a reaction. People panic. They spread fear. They make impulsive decisions. The brain is trying to create safety, but it does so through a system that can't always distinguish between real-time danger and abstract information. This is why cultivating the ability to respond instead of react is such a powerful form of self-regulation. A response doesn't mean you ignore the signals. It doesn't mean you deny that something significant may be happening. It means you create a moment of pause, a buffer between the stimulus and your behavior. In that pause, you allow the slower, more reflective parts of your brain to come online. The prefrontal cortex begins to ask better questions. Is this information reliable? What can I actually control in this situation? What would a wise course of action look like here? This isn't weakness. It's strength under pressure. It's discipline, clarity, and composure in a world that often trades those things for intensity and speed. One of the most profound things we can do in times of perceived crisis is to slow down our internal process. This doesn't mean becoming passive. It means becoming precise. There is an extraordinary difference between acting out of fear and acting from awareness. When you respond rather than react, you're not being controlled by the event. You're engaging with it on your own terms. You're taking ownership of your nervous system, your attention, and your actions. And in that, there's real power. What often fuels collective panic isn't the event itself. It's the chain reaction that follows. One person reacts, then another mirrors that response, and soon the emotional atmosphere shifts entirely. Fear spreads faster than fire. But the reverse is also true. Calm is contagious. When even one person chooses to respond thoughtfully instead of react impulsively, it creates a different rhythm. It introduces a new tempo into the system, one based on presence rather than panic. This doesn't require spiritual authority or intellectual brilliance. It just requires awareness and discipline. The idea that a final sign has appeared, whether taken literally or symbolically, can be a powerful trigger. It can pull people into states of urgency, anxiety, and anticipation, but it can also become a catalyst for consciousness. It can serve as a wake-up call, not to prepare for disaster, but to prepare ourselves, to anchor deeper into intentional living, to take stock of our choices, our beliefs, our direction, not from a place of fear, but from a place of responsibility. Ultimately, every moment of potential crisis offers us a choice. Do we become a reflection of the chaos, or do we become a source of coherence within it? Do we lose ourselves in speculation, or do we come back to the present and ask, what's the most grounded, meaningful thing I can do right now? That question is simple, but profound. And when asked with sincerity, it changes the tone of our lives. Responding is not about being right. It's about being rooted. It's about meeting uncertainty without abandoning ourselves to it. And in a world where everything seems to be accelerating, that kind of grounded awareness might be the most radical and necessary act of all. When people talk about signs, especially a final one, a tipping point, the moment where everything is supposed to shift, there's a temptation to look outward. We scan the horizon for changes in weather, politics, technology, or morality. We analyze events and try to fit them into a timeline. We debate whether what we're seeing is coincidence or convergence. But very often, the real invitation is not external at all. It's internal. It's not about watching what happens next out there. It's about paying attention to what this moment is doing to us, what it's asking of us, what it's revealing in us, and where it's pointing us. The truth is, we don't get to decide what happens in the world around us. We don't choose the timing of global disruption or cosmic symbolism, but we do have a choice in how we use the moment. We can let it pass through us unnoticed, or we can use it as a mirror. A final sign, whether literal or metaphorical, doesn't only signify an ending, it can be an entry point. It can call us back to the present and ask us to take ourselves seriously, not in an anxious or self-centered way, but in the sense of living with intention. Because for many people, signs are not just warnings, they're wake-up calls. They shake us out of our patterns, not to paralyze us, but to make us ask questions we've been avoiding. What matters most? Who am I becoming? What needs to change? When life feels uncertain, it's easy to contract. The nervous system wants safety, so it defaults to routine, distraction, and numbing. But there's also another response, one that doesn't come from survival instincts alone, but from the deeper, more integrated parts of who we are. We can expand. We can become more present, more focused, and more purposeful, not in spite of uncertainty, but because of it. There is something powerful that happens when a person begins to see uncertainty not as a threat, but as an invitation. It reframes the entire experience. Instead of waiting for life to return to normal, we begin asking how to create a new normal that reflects the kind of life we want to live. There's something deeply biological about this too. The brain is plastic. It's capable of rewiring itself in response to intention and repetition. This means our mindset isn't fixed. Our habits aren't final. Our emotional responses aren't permanent. But change doesn't just happen. It must be practiced. It must be chosen repeatedly. And moments of perceived finality, where things feel like they're closing or shifting, can actually open the door to transformation. And that's not romantic optimism. It's how adaptation works. The system reorganizes when the old pattern is disrupted. When people talk about the end of something, it's easy to get caught in the gravity of fear. But what if instead we view this as the beginning of something different? Something more refined, more aligned, more awake? What if the final sign doesn't mean collapse, but correction? A shift away from distraction and toward depth. A return to what matters. This kind of shift doesn't require massive changes all at once. It starts in small, consistent acts of awareness. Noticing how we speak, how we show up in our relationships, how we use our time, how we treat our bodies, how we shape our thoughts. One of the myths we carry is that transformation comes after things get better. That will change when life is calm, when we have time, when the pressure is off. But in reality, pressure is often the doorway. It squeezes out what doesn't serve us. It shows us what's real. It creates contrast. And that contrast can be clarifying. It can help us make decisions that aren't just based on convenience, but on conviction. So maybe the final sign isn't something to fear. Maybe it's something to notice deeply, to honor. Not because it tells us exactly what's coming, but because it gives us one more chance to align with who we actually want to be, to move from autopilot into attention, to stop waiting for someone else, to set the pace and take full responsibility for the way we live now, not later. The future is unknown, but our ability to meet it, awake, grounded, intentional, is not a mystery. It's a practice. And every crisis, every disruption, every so-called sign can either push us further into reactivity or call us into clarity. That choice belongs to no one else. It's ours. And that may be the most important message hidden in all of this. Not what's going to happen, but how ready we are to live with purpose, no matter what happens next.